Right, we're rolling. Nick and Bryan back at it again. Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, happy 2012, everybody. Hoping you enjoyed your Christmas. It was a pretty good event down here. Bryan and I have just done something very similar. We've both been on holiday and we've both been to one of the same places. And I'll get Bryan to talk about it first. We're going to talk about a little town in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the South Pacific which had a big earthquake.
Yeah, not exactly a little town. I think New Zealand's second biggest, isn't it? City.
Yeah,
Christchurch.
Which means a bit of a blimp in international standards. But,
obviously,
yeah.
But it's been a big deal for us guys, so yeah. We can't, we don't want to underplay the significance. And I thought that the idea would be to go there and spend a day or so. I had a friend who had been asking me, Julian Tarman, and he'd say, come down, I've got a place for you to stay. And he gave us a bit of a conducted tour of, let's be honest, the destruction of our second biggest city. And I have to say, you'll have probably seen the video I put up, Christchurch, city of shakes, I think I called it, or quakes. Can't actually remember now.
Shaky town.
Yeah, and it certainly has been a shaky town. Very, very sad video, really, because unlike the news items we get, the very small segments, this is actually quite extensive, and the video lasted about 10 minutes. It's a long time for you to be sitting watching that sort of thing. Yeah, so that's what I was doing, and in the meantime Nick was actually looking at a river that's actually disappeared.
Yeah, I'll hark back to Christchurch first. Bryan and I have just had a conversation about it, and we have very different feelings about it. I spent a bit of time in Lyttelton, which is where my parents are from, and the main drag in Lyttelton literally fell down, and if it didn't fall down they pulled it down. There's a lot of blank spaces, and there's a lot of flowers being planted in the blank spaces, and there's a lot of things starting to happen. And I think what I saw there, which was very, very encouraging, was that the local people in particular had said, well, damn it, we got to do something. And they've actually started doing it. And there was a positiveness and a vibrancy there, and there was a sort of like, damn the bloody authorities, we don't give a stuff about them, we're just going to bloody do it. And it sort of leads me on to a second thing which I was talking about with Bryan before, which is reading On the Automatic Earth, Stoneleigh, that's Nicole Foss, talking about trust horizons. How that you trust your authorities or your corporate structures or all of these people to a certain degree, but gradually as they become less trustworthy or less relevant to you, the horizon of visibility of them goes way backwards. And in the end, they're not there, you're doing it yourself.
Yeah.
And I think there's very much a degree of that happening in the Christchurch area. Lyttelton was a really good example to me of it. So,
but I acknowledge all that. Yeah. It's just that in the time that I was there, one night, 5 earthquakes.
Yeah.
And I started my tour with my good friend Julian Tarman, who hopefully will be looking at this video because I'll probably put it on Facebook. We actually started in the cemetery. And it was sort of depressing looking at rows of headstones that had just been flattened. And you just knew that they were going to be kind of on the last thing to do list, you know.
Yeah. Sort of brings a whole new meaning to a game of dominoes, really.
Well, I mean, I can laugh now. But Nick, seeing the enormity of the task and the fact that it wasn't just streets but blocks of wonderful established middle income homes that have been walked away from, the fact that the Avon River, areas along that river have dropped and they've sandbagged hoping to contain it, but that won't be the long-term answer to those problems. And so, look, all I'm saying, Nick, is I agree. Look, it was wonderful to see the container mall and the fact that the innovation and the spirit, but we also know that along with that, hey, if you're going to get 4 or 5 earthquakes a day, and it's going to go on for years, it's a very demoralising place to find yourself in.
Yeah, it is. I'm of the opinion that it will settle down. I mean, geologically it has to, but then it will reactivate some stage in the future. So it's from the perspective of anyone, anywhere in the world where you have this kind of disaster, I don't think it really pays to do what our government is doing and our elected or official representatives are doing, which is harking on the parameters of what it was before and saying that is the correct way to do things. We really need to take a far broader and longer term vision and actually say, well, okay, this is going to happen again, so what the hell do we do about it? One of the great things, I think, and it's a right decision in Christchurch, is that those areas along the riverbank, in particular down the Avon, were the ones which liquefied. They turn them into the red zone. I'm fearful that eventually they will be allowed to be developed again. They should actually go back and never be touched again or used for an appropriate use such as horticulture. And these are the problems we have where we put commercial imperatives as primary when we're actually looking at something which, you know, those imperatives may not matter in 15, 20 years time, but you're stuck with the consequences of them. And I'm sort of fearful of that. And it sort of leads me on to the next thing which we did. I walked, biked, four-wheel drived, using lots of petrol. And
peak oil man
here. Down a river in Canterbury called the Selwyn, and Selwyn's what's called currently an ephemeral river, and that means it dries up. When you go to Canterbury, what you're doing is you're sitting on this enormous glacial outwash plain from the last ice age, and so big flat tablelands, but it actually slopes quite considerably. And the rivers coming through are normally fed from the mountain snow, but this particular river is a rain-fed river. And at the turn of the century, it would flow for 9 or 10 months of a year at least, and only dried out in the middle of sections very rarely. And since we've developed the agriculture on the plains, it's dry most of the time. The middle sections of the river do not flow. It flows from the mountains to the start of the plains, and then it sort of emerges from underground about 15 kilometres from the lake which it flows into, which is actually a captured estuary. It's called Lake Ellesmere. But what it represents is a long-term piece of damage to the environment, and it brings me onto this whole thing of how the media portray these things, how we're portrayed what we're living in. Because if you are anywhere in the world to go out and look at your environment, you're probably actually looking at an environmental disaster and not noticing it because you're so used to it.
Isn't that dreadful?
Yeah. And this is what it is that people have got used to how it is. So what we did is we photographed every single river crossing, whether it was ford or bridge, and we've got a record of 2 days on the river in the summer, where it's dry, where it's wet, what's going on. And we'll publish that as a calendar. And I may even put it up on a website free to charge for anyone who wants to watch, courtesy of Bryan.
Absolutely.
He's the man.
You know,
actually, it just represented a disaster. And during the same week, we had the breakup of a wreck which was sitting on a reef up in North New Zealand. And the media were over it like a rash. There was oil coming ashore, and I'm thinking, hell, you don't go down and have a look at this lake which is eutrophying every year, this river which is gone. You never even mention it, you know. Yeah. And that's sad.
Well, actually, it's made me think about the whole way that the environment operates. And we've kind of built this picture of permanence, you know, that and expectations. And in actual fact, the environment is, as we're finding out, quite dynamic. And you can't actually rely on any kind of permanence. So kind of like we're having to, reluctantly I guess, because I think we're kicking and shouting and screaming and saying we want it all back the way it was. But in actual fact, in reality, you know, that's probably not going to happen. And they're talking Christchurch 20 years of aftershocks, which is just ridiculous if you think about it. Who's going to be able to endure that? And of course, so there's been huge departures from Christchurch.
If you get it timed right, you wouldn't need an alarm clock.
Well, you know, we can laugh, but I have to tell you that after 5 shakes in Christchurch, I was quite happy to leave. But I'm kind of more.
Bryan.
No,
in the shower and didn't even notice.
I mean, age has got something to do with resilience, and so this is where I empathise with elderly people who have worked and try to make a community out of a place where they've been living, finding that the ground's all been chopped out from under them. And but even more disturbing is what you're saying, Nick, about how the environment can degrade in such a way that you don't even notice it. So I find that profoundly disturbing.
Yeah.
And I think, to be honest, as I think about it, that river drying up, the lake disappearing, the term you use for it, just remind me.
Ephemeral?
No, when you talk about the river and the lake disappearing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's basically... ephemeral was the term I used. It becomes an ephemeral river, but it's things like the eutrophication.
Eutrophication. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And well, that is really serious. And actually, the fact that we even allow this to happen, and there's been scant, if any, media about it. I mean, basically, we've got our heads in a strange place, right?
Well, if I was to put it into perspective for you guys out there, when I was a student, I used to go out and think this was a natural environment, and we're going back 40 years ago, or slightly less, except I'm getting old. And it was only when I really started studying it and then also looked at the history of it and the previous photographs that I realised that it wasn't that way. And in my lifetime, the situation has become far more severe. So it's more like erosion, an erosive sort of form of pollution. It's an erosive form of land change than it is something which is dramatically obvious straight away. And so consequently we don't care, and we commit to doing things which exacerbate the situation. Then everyone jumps up and down and it happens, and then they all relax again. The example in Canterbury is the draining of the aquifers for water rights and the cows on the land. And that really is a second major environmental disaster for the area. It's an economic boom, and the reason we accept these things is because we want to feed ourselves today and live, keep the party going as we do. And I suppose the message I can really point out here is that that's fine. Think of your grandchildren. Yeah. Because it won't be a boom for them.
Well, the whole thing about this total loss of respect for the environment and for nature, and not even thinking really about our relationship with nature, kind of, I can remember being very impressed with a theologian which I was fond of as a younger person, Francis Schaeffer, talking about the earth as our fair sister. And if ever we needed to be reminded of our relationship with the earth, I guess it's now, because I think actually we're moving into a phase where we can't actually turn back. And Nick and I were just discussing over tea. It was wonderful to have Nick here for a meal tonight. We were just talking about how blasé we're all getting now on this whole issue of peak oil, because I was just reading another blog just a few minutes back, where this chap was saying that there's so many discussion groups now, and it's all just turning into a talk fest. And I guess, the point was, the good old human condition, much easier to just talk about the thing rather than do anything.
Yeah, I for one said to Bryan, he asked me why I cut off Facebook and things like that. And I said, I'm just spending too much time on this crap and it's not actually doing anything. And so when I went on holiday this year, I made a conscious decision I was going to do something which, was slightly different and may or may not be positive, but I was offline for 10 days. It was bloody wonderful.
And I'd have to say to you that the time that I spent down in South Island, not in the devastated areas, but just actually reminding myself of a wonderful natural environment that the South Island represents, it was incredibly recharging. So, we bicycled around Lake Wanaka, areas where you can't actually drive, but you can walk, and there's a sort of cycle track. Yeah. And it was wonderful for the first time walking around Lake Matheson. I've never actually done that before. And seeing that wonderful postcard view at the end.
I've seen the photos, but you've never been in them.
Yeah, no. So you get these beautiful reflections But, you know, there was the bad with it as well, because we went and looked at the glacier, and the glaciers are retreating. And I guess as I was sitting there, standing actually in this wonderful little bush scene, framed by bush, looking out onto the glacier, and thinking, well, what's the end game going to be? You know, because actually it's sort of like a, you know, it's like a sort of a calendar that ends. And you're saying, well, when the glaciers are gone, what actually is going to be, you know, the end result? And I think actually it's very telling in terms of the climate change that we're witnessing. And also I began to think about how all this has happened basically within a few hundred years with the Industrial Revolution.
I was actually reading a book while I was away about the Franciscans and the Dominicans, Dominicans in particular, and some Franciscans were part of the Inquisition. And it sort of gave me to think about courts and St. Francis of all things, the old apocryphal story of St. Francis with the birds, talking to the birds, and actually the point of that whole thing was that he was saying that you're actually part of nature, you're not apart from it. Man does not stand alone. And then I thought about, okay, well, if that's the message, these Dominicans forming the Inquisition or being part of it, just imagine if the birds were the Inquisition, how they would condemn us. You think about everything which we've affected, how that would condemn us for our actions. And that might sound like a really silly kind of thing to say, but in actual fact, put yourself in the defendant's box at the court and face the charges as an individual, and you'll see collectively we probably are guiltier than guilty. And the people who will suffer for this, so we're coming back to people again, it's not just the environment, is our children. Yeah, absolutely. And our children's children.
And on that sober note, we'll wrap this one up and just say, you know, great to be back in the city. Wonderful to have Nick here.
Thank you.
Always enjoy his company and his perspective. And we look forward to a bit of your feedback from the good old budget home studio here in Wellington.
It's great. We can broadcast from anywhere, Brian. It's
Indeed.
good. This is the best place.
And all the best for the rest of 2012, guys.